This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Last year, when the European economy was struggling with rampant inflation and stagnant growth, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen commissioned former ECB Governor Mario Draghi to write a report on how the EU could regain its competitive edge. After months of delays and teasing press conferences, on Monday, Draghi finally published his much-anticipated report to the public. And, well, it didn't disappoint. In the report, Draghi slammed Europe's stagnant economy and argued that Europe would need an additional 800 billion euros in investment every year, equivalent to about 5% of GDP, if it wanted to deal with the numerous threats facing the continent, while competing with America and China economically. Acknowledging that no national government possessed the financial firepower to fund this level of investment, Draghi then called for greater cooperation and more joint borrowing at the EU level, restarting a heated debate across the continent about the degree to which Europe should be federalized, not just fiscally, but strategically too. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Draghi's prognosis for the European economy, his proposed remedies, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. In his report, Draghi begins by outlining what he sees as Europe's main problem: weak productivity. For context, productivity basically measures economic output per hour worked, and it's pretty much the most important metric in economics. If your GDP is growing but your productivity isn't, then it just means that you've either got more people or you're working more hours. In fact, Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman once said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. Anyway, by most metrics, European productivity has been essentially stagnant since really the 2008 financial crisis, and European productivity is now well behind that of the US. According to Draghi's report, this productivity gap accounts for 72% of the overall gap in GDP per capita that's opened up between America and the EU in the last 15 years. According to Draghi, for the past 15 years or so, Europe has been able to pretend that this productivity crisis was no more than a mild inconvenience. High immigration rates kept GDP growth high and demographics balanced, while a booming global economy created strong demand for European exports, compensating for weak domestic demand. Unfortunately, Europe can no longer pretend that this productivity slowdown is anything less than a crisis. An increasing wariness towards high levels of immigration and ever lower birth rates mean that Europe's demographic situation is only going to get worse, putting strain on national economies and the European welfare state. On top of that, an increasingly fragmented and decelerating global economy not only makes it harder for European businesses to export abroad, but also introduces new geopolitical risks to European supply chains. And decarbonizing the continent while simultaneously carving out market share in high-tech industries of the future will require unprecedented amounts of investment. Now, to remedy all of these problems, Draghi proposes three transformations. The first is about improving European productivity by, quote, accelerating innovation and finding new growth engines. Here, Draghi describes Europe's industrial stagnation, pointing out that the European economy is still focused on mature technologies like cars, and that European business have failed to invest in newer technology like software or AI. The comparison with the US here is glaring. In the past 50 years, Europe has created 0 new companies with a market capitalization over 100 billion euros, while the US has created tens of companies above this threshold, as well as 6 with a valuation over 1 trillion euros, all in tech. Draghi blames this innovation deficit on EU red tape and insufficient market integration, and calls for a streamlining of regulation to remedy it, as well as a new upskilling agenda to help European workers adapt to new technologies. The second transformation is a joint plan for decarbonization. Here, Draghi points out that high energy prices in Europe, which are 2 to 3 times that of the US, represent a structural disadvantage to European industry, and that the long-term solution is to invest in renewable energy to bring prices down in the long term. Draghi admits that this will require massive amounts of investment, and argues that the only feasible way of achieving these investments is more joint borrowing, i.e., borrowing done at the EU rather than national level. Now, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but this is a reoccurring theme throughout Draghi's report. He argues that in many places, joint borrowing and deeper integration across the EU is the only way to generate the fiscal firepower to stimulate Europe's stagnant economy. The third transformation, though, is all about increasing security and reducing dependencies. In other words, moving supply chains out of strategically risky places like China. Now, at first glance, this might sound a bit counterintuitive. After all, de-risking, as it's often known, is pretty expensive, and it's not clear that Europe's crumbling economy can afford these new supply chain frictions. However, Draghi argues that diversified supply chains should reduce economic uncertainty, which will, in turn, facilitate greater investment, and therefore end up being a net positive for the European economy. Again, Draghi argues that an effective de-risking strategy will require better intra-European cooperation, and his report calls for a genuine EU foreign economic policy to replace the patchwork of national industrial strategies currently emerging in Europe. All in all, the overarching theme of Draghi's report is that Europe needs deeper integration on both fiscal and strategic issues to restart its stagnant economy and survive the coming decades. Decarbonising the European economy, renovating its militaries, protecting the welfare state, modernising European industry, and returning productivity to its pre-2008 trend, all at the same time, will require literally hundreds of billions of euros in investment each and every year. In fact, Draghi's report puts the number at about 800 billion euros, or about 5% of the entirety of the EU's GDP, which would imply an increase in the EU's overall investment level from 22% of GDP to 27%. Draghi himself admits that this would be historically unprecedented. For comparison, investment under the Marshall Plan, the US-led plan to restore the European economy after World War II, came to about 2% of GDP. And no European states have the fiscal space to borrow this amount of money afresh. France and Germany, for instance, are both currently engaging in another round of austerity, and the European economy is simply too weak to fund this investment via massive tax hikes or spending cuts elsewhere. This is why Draghi recommends that Europe facilitate at least some of this investment via new debt instruments at the EU level. To avoid double spending and maximize efficiency, Draghi also recommends closer European cooperation across a whole range of sectors, including defense procurement, foreign policy, and industrial policy. While expanding the EU's policy remit might sound like the sort of thing that would increase bureaucracy, after all, it would mean more bureaucrats in Brussels, Draghi tacitly argues that greater European cooperation will actually reduce frictions by standardizing across the continent. In the aggregate, this is a Macron-esque call for a more federal Europe, but justified in economic terms as the only way to save Europe's flailing economy. With issues like these, it's often hard to come to the right conclusions. So if you want to improve your decision making, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. For instance, there's the Scientific Thinking course, which takes you on an interactive tour of our physical world. You'll engage with key scientific principles and theories, from simple machines like gears and pulleys to Einstein's special theory of relativity. It's not just a bunch of lectures either. You'll learn by doing, with hands-on lessons that will have you comparing circuits to understand voltage and current, playing snooker to learn the rules of collision, planning your itinerary for an intergalactic music festival on a space-time diagram, and more. That way, you'll build your natural intuition while gaining deep knowledge of scientific principles. Find out more and try everything Brilliant has to offer for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR or by clicking the link in the description. That way, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.